This movie was no slam dunk, and Shaq did try to warn us with just as many basketball references as possible.
Never could make the free throws.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Not So Super Movie Reviews. Today we're going to be talking about the 1997 smash hit Steel with Shaquille O'Neal. This movie had a critic score of 12% and a user review score of 16%. So pretty much in agreement that this movie sucked balls. Let's go a little deeper and see if maybe I agree with pretty much everyone. Alright, so first let's talk about what works about this movie, and the first thing you gotta say is just the bitchin' soundtrack. I mean, it's a combination of your typical 90s superhero music, this sort of like, high energy, orchestral sort of, dana 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 dana, but mixed with, I am available for soundtracks, by the way, mixed with like funk elements to sort of like remind you that he's African American, which is something this movie does a lot of, actually.
Johnny!
I dig the soundtrack. It has a little bit more flavor than your typical soundtrack, even though it is pretty corny at times, and of course it mixes in some other elements like R&B and things. But overall, I think it's a plus. I enjoyed it when it came around. The second thing that works about this movie, it's something that I've mentioned before on previous movies that we'll talk about, is just the pure 90s aesthetic. Watching this movie, it just takes you right back to the 90s. I felt like I was, 10 again, seeing this movie. It has a very, Walker, Texas Ranger sort of vibe to it. With the music and the outfits and everything, and it still connects you to a time period. Even if it wasn't, the best movie ever, it does still give you that feeling, if you grew up in the 90s like I did, of being back in the 90s. I'm a nostalgic person. I got no problem telling you that I like to feel nostalgic. I think a lot of people are like, oh, nostalgia, but it's something that we all feel, and watching this movie, you will feel like you're back in the 90s. I guarantee it. Unfortunately, that about wraps up what I liked about this movie. First of all, what I think didn't work about this movie is very obvious from the beginning when I said that this movie was starring Shaq, which is the acting. I mean, the acting is terrible, but the point I really want to make is not that it's terrible because of Shaq. Shaq is a terrible actor. No offense, buddy, but you kind of expect that from Shaq. I don't watch Kazam to, see some Oscar-level acting. I see it because I loved Shaq, and I want to see him play a genie in a movie, So I really don't blame Shaq. Shaq kind of went out on a limb and started doing these acting roles, which was completely out of his element. So actually, I think he's doing great. What really sticks out like a sore thumb is the acting from, actual actors.
Well, I'll be dipped in shit and rolling breadcrumbs.
One of Odessa's recipes?
The second thing that doesn't work about this movie is the origin story. This is at its core an origin story. It's 45 minutes before we see Steel in the full costume fighting bad guys for the first time, which not that out of the ordinary for an origin story to take a while to get there. But I do think that's something that, more recent superhero movies have kind of tapped into, which is like, maybe spend less time with the normal person learning superpowers and a little more time with the person with the superpowers. The problem here is that it doesn't use that 45 minutes effectively. Like I said before, this movie is super slow. It's very, very dry, and the origin story essentially for both our hero and our villain are just they're army guys that make weapons for the army, and both of them leave the army either because of good things or bad things, and evil guy is evil, good guy is good. As far as the origin story goes, there's tons of leaps in logic. You know, he has this friend who's injured in the army, Sparky, who's sort of the love interest. She's in a VA hospital. She's depressed. She can't use her legs anymore. And Shaq just comes in and he gives her a speech. He breaks open a window so that she can feel the wind. And then he literally picks up the wheelchair and carries her out as everyone in the VA hospital applaud. Like, nobody's going to stop a 7-foot tall man from stealing a woman in a wheelchair. Like, okay, fine. You know, of course we know they're friends, but they don't know that. And, you know, then we take her to Uncle Joe's junkyard. We don't know Uncle Joe. Who's Uncle Joe? Why does he own a junkyard? How come he's good at building weapons? You know, all of a sudden, we're introduced to these new characters and new locations. You know, the last thing, and this kind of bugged me the whole movie, is just the completely lackluster action scenes. The action scenes in this movie are so slow. You know, Shaq in his steel costume is just very limited in his movement, and it looks very cheap. And so all he can really do is sort of saunter around and point his gun while fireworks effects come out of it. And it's some of the action scenes, some of these chase scenes are almost relaxing to watch because the music's not very intense. It's cutting between shots of him just like jumping over a fence kind of slowly because Shaq's a huge dude.
It's on now.
In general, the choreography for all of the fight scenes and chase scenes, pretty much every action scene is just extremely lackluster, slow-paced, and, you know, for a movie that doesn't tell a good story and doesn't have good acting, you would hope that at least we could have some pretty over-the-top action. There's tons of superhero movies that get away with not being great movies in lieu of having some really good action. It's only, I think, like an hour and a half. It's a shorter movie, but it kind of plays really long because the origin story doesn't really do much with it. It's 45 minutes before he even gets the suit, and then when he gets the suit, the action scenes are just so boring and slow that it's not even really that much fun to watch. So in general, this movie didn't have to happen. That brings us to my final review, which is, you know, who do I think was right? The critics or the users? In general, they're pretty much the same score. They're only 4 points off, but I'm going to have to agree with the lower number here, which is the 12 with the critics. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't a blockbuster superhero movie. Every bit of this movie felt like a made-for-TV movie. It should have just been a Saturday morning special. I don't know what the budget was like, but it didn't feel like a big blockbuster movie. Steel just sort of feels like an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger where a guy in a robot suit shows up. Also, I just got to get this off my chest. You know, Sparky is the love interest this whole movie. They set this up from the very first scene. They're testing weapons in the beginning, and they have this little secret handshake where they touch fingers, and the whole movie he calls her babe. You know, they're not really acting like a couple, but you're like pretty much assuming like, okay, they're a couple. And then at the end, you know, his grandma or mom decides to open up a restaurant that she has been wanting to open up, which was a little subplot going on, and she does open it up in LA, and they're all eating there after the big finale. And you know, she reveals that she modified her wheelchair so that she can stand up. And she does, and Shaq gets up, and you're like, okay, finally these two are going to kiss. And he gives her a big ol' hug, and then everybody claps, and the movie's over. My girl Sparky got robbed. Alright everybody, thank you for checking out another episode of Not So Super Movie Reviews. If you like the video, click the like button. You can subscribe to get more of this exact same kind of content. If there's a movie you'd like to see me do next, it has to be based on a comic book or be about superheroes, and it has to be under a 65% score on Rotten Tomatoes. But let me know in the comments if you've seen this movie and you have other things or questions about this movie. Just let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk about it. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.